some analysis on the meeting with Andrew Cooper. He's a professor at the University of Waterloo's Balsillie School of International Affairs. He joins us now from the G20 site in Rio de Janeiro. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today. Now, in Xi's speech, he said global development should be more inclusive and more resilient. What did you take from his comments, and especially in terms of his goals of the summit?
Welcome from Rio. No, there's a great deal of synergy, I think, between the Chinese and the Brazilian views on inclusion. In some ways, it's symbolic to involve much more civil society groups within the country, but at the same time, these big mega initiatives on food, on environment, and indeed trying to create a different pillar within the G20, the social pillar. I think we see that enthusiasm. In some ways, it's a coming out for the Global South because it's such a different agenda than when the G20 first started. Very narrow, very focused on the financial crisis on 2008. Now we're really seeing an inclusive agenda. And of course, with South Africa next year, we're going to see sort of a run of Global South countries, in some ways in coordination with the agenda.
Brazil's President Lula da Silva opened talks outlining the goal to combat poverty and hunger, a keen issue that Brazil has wanted to work on in some time. It's something, Xi is well versed in terms of development in China. Can you talk a little bit more about policies and suggestions that were made in terms of how to alleviate poverty in Brazil, in other countries?
For sure. I mean, we've seen China having a model of raising millions of people out of poverty, creating a different middle class, creating an equality of people, rural and urban. So in some ways, it's a good lesson for Brazil. And there's already been programs when Lula was president before in terms of food security, getting sort of into schools and giving people lunch money and lunch programs. So again, there's going to be a lot of resonance to move that from the domestic into the international. Talking and hearing the Minister of Social Development today, there's a network now, and it's interesting how many countries have already joined the alliance on food security and initiatives trying to remedy inequalities about food insecurity. So again, I think it's going to be a good model. I think there's a huge amount of initiatives that really play into that inclusion. The social summit the last couple of days, I think, showed the enthusiasm for this. And indeed, I think so many different groups within Brazilian society, I think, are ready and willing. So rather than sort of protesting, where you've seen protests in Brazil in many of the mega events before, in the Olympics and the FIFA World Cup, now we see a great deal of equanimity and a great deal of sort of accommodation to this program. It's quite interesting. In a country that has a lot of problems, huge inequalities, huge issues of rural-urban inequalities, and at the same time, there's a great deal of social peace around the G20. So again, I think a lot of optimism from India last year to Brazil this year to South Africa, and again, the model of China, I think, is sort of in the background, a shadow.
Interwoven, of course, in many of these issues is the climate crisis, and that's a topic that's taken centre stage at the summit, with countries breaking a deadlock over climate finance, I understand. Can you tell us how they got there and why, it's more of a struggle at COP29 in Azerbaijan right now?
Yeah, it is a struggle. It was very interesting. The Secretary General of the UN made an appearance yesterday. He basically called on the G20 countries to do more and to really take the lead on those negotiations. Again, it shows that the COP this year, 29, really didn't come up to expectations. I think where we see some sort of compromise is in the financing. The sense of not only do the developed countries in some ways ways having to make that commitment, and I think for all sorts of both symbolic, normative, ideational, pragmatic reasons, it's a good idea. But now, at least with the developing countries, maybe having some of those making voluntary contributions, and I think this is the way that can be some sort of breakthrough. Again, what's fascinating, of course, is that the COP30 is going to be in Brazil next year, up in Amazonia. So again, we can see perhaps a chance for Brazil to have leadership on that front as well. And Brazil also having the BRIC summit in the near future as well. So again, the spotlight is going to be on Brazil for the next 2 years.
So we're talking about major issues of social policy here, climate change, but of course, an incoming Trump presidency is looming large over many of these meetings. Trade wars, climate resistance is just a few of the concerns. What are leaders saying about the sharp shift in US policy that we're likely to see?
Well, there's polarization. You see a country like Argentina that in some ways takes similar views under the current presidency. But for the most part, I think it's waiting and trying to get as much done before Trump is inaugurated, and certainly before the next G20. And of course, this is going to be very complicated, because if the United States is supposed to convene the G20 in 2 years, it's going to be complicated and difficult to see the contrast between Rio, Johannesburg, and then somewhere in the United States. The other issue, of course, is tariffs. We see that, of course, this is one of the great focal points of Donald Trump. He said that tariffs is one of the best words in the English language. So again, he's going to push, and of course, this is where China is really probably very much in a different sort of spotlight, because of course much of the threatened tariffs is going to be focused on China, as well as other countries like Mexico. So again, I think most probably here we've seen already some signs by China taking initiatives on developing countries, saying that they're going to either reduce tariffs or eliminate tariffs completely. So again, I think there's this attempt to try to differentiate from the Trump administration off into the future, even if it's the near future in terms of the inauguration, or it's the longer term in terms of the hosting and the presidency of the G20.
All right, Andrew Cooper, really appreciate your time.